The first night I thought it was a deer. That is worth saying up front, because the rest of what I am about to tell you is going to sound like the kind of thing a man says when he has decided he wants attention. I am not that man. I have spent 22 years as a game warden in the Ouachita Range, and I have never once filed a report I could not stand behind. I tell you that not because it should matter to you, but because it matters to me that you understand what I was before all of this. The property is 11 acres off a private road about 9 miles from the Talamina Ridge, backed up against a section of national forest that runs unbroken for 60,000 acres to the south and east. I have owned it for 14 years. I bought it when my marriage was already ending, before I knew the marriage was ending, which is its own kind of lesson about timing. My kid is 41 years old, and I have met my grandchildren twice. That is on me. I know that. I bought the land because I needed a place to go that was mine alone, and it has been that ever since. I had a camp structure at the back of the property, not a cabin. Just a 3-sided shelter I built myself out of treated lumber over 2 weekends, open to the south with a fire ring 10 yards out. I used it mostly during August, which in the Ouachitas means heat that does not break after dark and a humidity that makes the air feel occupied. Timber rattlers active in the creek bottoms, copperheads in the rockier ground above the creek. August in that country is not comfortable, but it is alive in a specific way, the canopy so dense by midsummer that you walk through a kind of green twilight even at noon, and the nights loud with insects and frogs in a way that can take years to stop hearing as noise and start hearing as texture. I am telling you about the land because the land matters. What happened there was not accidental. I understand that now in a way I did not then. The first night was a Monday, late July, crossing into August. I had come out after a long week. Nothing unusual about the evening fire. A meal I do not remember, some reading until the light failed. I turned in around 10. I have a particular insomnia that has followed me since my mid-50s. Not the kind where you cannot sleep. The kind where you wake around 2 and lie there for an hour before the body decides it is done. I was awake at roughly 2:15 and I heard movement at the timber edge. The timber edge on the south side of the camp was about 40 yards out. The property line ran along it, and beyond it the national forest began. I knew that edge the way you know the face of a place you have spent years watching. I knew what deer sounded like moving through the cane along the lower ground. I knew what a coyote pack sounded like when it moved, that loose conversational quality. The way the sounds stayed distributed. I knew what a black bear sounded like, which is to say heavier than you think, and with a particular rhythm to the footfall when it is moving slowly and minding its own business. What I heard that first night was a single set of footfalls, slow bipedal cadence, and I know what that word means. I am using it precisely. I am not using it loosely the way people do to imply what they do not want to state directly. 2 beat. Left, right, moving from east to west along the timber edge, unhurried, at the pace of something that does not believe it is observed. I lay still for a while, probably 8 minutes, maybe 10. The sounds continued and then stopped. I got up, went to the fire ring, got the coals going enough for a little light, and stood there looking south. Nothing at the timber edge that I could identify. No eye shine, and if it had been a deer, I would have had eye shine. No sound after that. I went back in, slept maybe another hour, drove home in the morning. I thought about it on the drive. Deer moving slowly on two legs does not happen. Black bears move bipedally sometimes. Short bursts standing to scent, short shuffling steps. But nothing like a sustained bipedal walk along 40 yards of timber edge at 2 in the morning. I wrote it off as something I had heard wrong in a half-awake state, filed it in the place where unexplained things go when you have been in the woods long enough to know that unexplained things accumulate and do not always mean anything. That was a Tuesday morning. I came back out the following Friday evening. At 11:30 that night I was sitting by the fire. Not reading, just sitting. I had been thinking about my son Marcus, as I do when I sit still long enough, not the estrangement itself, which I have stopped trying to think my way through, but the specific absence of his voice, which used to call every few weeks and now does not. I had been thinking about calling him for about a month and had not done it. That is the kind of information that lives in the body and surfaces when you are sitting alone by a fire in the dark. I heard it at the timber edge. Same direction. Same quality of sound. Slower this time, or rather, not slower, but with pauses, 3 or 4 steps, then a pause of maybe 15 seconds, then 3 or 4 steps again. Moving east to west as before. I did not move. I let the fire do what fire does. After 4 minutes of this, the movement stopped altogether, and I heard nothing for a long time. Then, from a position maybe 20 yards further west than where the last sounds had been, I heard breathing. That is the only word for it. Slow, controlled, deeper pitched than a human breath at rest. Not labored, not distressed, the kind of breathing you hear from something very large that is standing very still. I did not get up. Here is what I know about black bears in the Ouachita National Forest. Because it is relevant, the population is healthy, one of the densest in the south-central United States, and August is a critical feeding period. A bear in late summer in that country is in hyperphagia, eating 20,000 calories a day to build the fat reserves for denning. Its world at that time of year is almost entirely about food. A bear at my fire at night would be interested in the fire ring, the food smells, the cooler. It would not be standing quietly at the timber edge breathing at me at 11:30 at night. That was the second night. I came back on a Tuesday. I had told Leland Horn, my supervisor at the district office, a man who had 17 years on me and whose opinion I had always valued above the opinion of almost anyone I knew professionally, that I was taking a few extra days out. Leland knew the property. He had helped me survey the western fence line the year after I bought it, a favor I had never stopped being grateful for. He did not ask questions. I want to be clear about my state of mind on that Tuesday drive out. I was not afraid. That is not bravado. I had been in the field with bears, with a mountain lion once in the Eastern District, with situations that carry real physical risk, and I know the difference between what my body does in a fear state and what it was doing on that drive. What it was doing was paying attention in a way that had a quality of problem-solving to it. Something unusual was happening at my property. I had 22 years of wildlife fieldwork, and I wanted to know what it was. I set up a trail camera on a stake at the south edge of the fire ring, angled toward the timber edge. 8 megapixel, infrared trigger, motion activated. I have used them in the field for years. I knew what they captured and what they missed. That was Tuesday. I set it up in the afternoon and sat by the fire until midnight. Nothing at the timber edge. No sounds, no breathing, no movement. I slept through the night without the 2:15 waking, went to bed wondering if the presence of the camera or my behavior that evening, something in the way I moved or set up or positioned myself, had communicated something to whatever was out there. I came back Friday. The camera had 41 images from Wednesday and Thursday nights. 37 were deer, 4 does, 2 fawns at different times, 1 small buck on Thursday morning at 6 a.m. 3 were raccoon images, motion blur at the fire ring. 1 image taken at 2:07 on Thursday morning showed the timber edge at its fullest resolution. There was something standing there. Not a detail image. The infrared gives you outline against dark tree line, and the outline was this: tall, very broad across the shoulder, arms hanging lower than a man's arms hang, standing completely still. The shape of the head was wrong for a bear. Bears in a standing position have a particular headset that you learn to recognize over years. A heaviness at the muzzle that tilts the silhouette forward. This was not that. This was upright, balanced, head set level on the shoulders. The height, based on the cedar post I knew was at the timber edge, I had set it myself. 6 feet to the first notch put the top of the figure above the notch. I sat with that image for a long time. The thing about 22 years of fieldwork is that it gives you a framework for ruling things out and a trained hesitation about ruling things in. A black bear standing briefly bipedal, photographed at infrared range with some motion possible. Except that the image had 0 motion blur. Whatever had been standing there had been standing still for the full duration of the exposure. Still in a way that implied intent, not transition. The image was not a bear standing up to scent. It was something choosing to stand at the timber edge at 2 in the morning and hold still long enough to be photographed cleanly. I did not file anything. There was nothing to file. I had a camera image of a silhouette I could not identify. That was the 3rd appearance. I came back the following week, a Wednesday this time. I brought Warren Causey, a retired wildlife biologist I had worked with on 2 surveys in the early years of my district posting. A careful man with a reputation for what his colleagues called forensic patience, the ability to look at something for a long time before naming it. I did not tell him what I had seen. I told him I had an unidentified animal on the property and I wanted a second set of eyes. He drove up from Mena that afternoon. We sat at the fire that night from 9 until roughly midnight. Warren had been talking intermittently about a survey he was consulting on in the northern Ouachita's black bear population movement in response to a series of timber sales that had fragmented the old growth sections on 2 adjacent drainages. He knew that country the way I knew my 11 acres, from the inside out, from the specific level of what grows where and at what elevation and in what company. At 11:53, Warren stopped talking mid-sentence. I watched his face rather than looking at the timber edge immediately. He was looking at a point about 30 yards south of the fire ring, slightly east of where the sounds had been before. His expression was not fear. I want to be precise about this. It was the expression of a man looking at a data point that does not match his model. The careful recalibrating quality that I recognized because I had been wearing it for 2 weeks. I looked. Against the tree line, the canopy opened slightly at that spot, and on a clear August night there is enough ambient light from a sky that carries the accumulated glow of everything below it. There was a silhouette. Tall, still, the same shoulder width I had seen in the camera image, except that now I was seeing it in real space at 30-odd yards, and the proportion of it against the cedars I knew the height of was unambiguous. Warren said very quietly. Garrett, I said, I see it. We sat still for I believe it was 4 minutes, though the duration felt significantly longer. The silhouette did not move, it did not make a sound. It stood at the timber edge with a stillness that no large animal maintains voluntarily in the presence of a fire and 2 people and the smell of food. That stillness was information. A bear at that distance, with those sensory inputs, does not stand still. A deer does not stand still. A coyote does not stand still. The only animals I know that practice voluntary stillness at close range in the presence of humans are predators in ambush posture, and what I was looking at was not in ambush posture. It was upright, and it was watching. Then it was not there. No sound of departure, or rather there was sound, but it was at the far east end of the timber edge, 30 yards east of where it had been, with no intervening footfall sequence that either of us had tracked. It had moved along the tree line without making the sounds its mass should have made. Warren and I sat by that fire until 2 in the morning without speaking much. What we said was practical confirmation of what we had each seen, comparison of details, the biologist's habit of triangulating observations. He agreed on the height assessment. He agreed on the stillness. He agreed on the departure, the absence of a proportionate sound signature for the mass involved. He said as we were banking the fire, I do not know what that was. I said I did not either. That was not quite true. I had a word for it. I had been carrying the word for 2 weeks and had not said it out loud. The word was Bigfoot, and I knew even as I held it back that holding it back was partly professional reflex and partly something else, the knowledge that once you say the word the conversation changes, and you cannot change it back. Warren said good night and drove back to Mina. I do not think he slept, but I did not ask. That was the 4th night. On the 5th night I went alone, no camera, no other witness. I want to be honest about why I went without those things, because I have asked myself about the decision many times since. Part of it was that I wanted to see it without the mediation of equipment or another person's reaction. Part of it was that I had begun by that point to understand that whatever was coming to the timber edge was not coming to threaten me. 4 appearances. No aggression, no vocalization directed at me, no approach inside the 40-yard mark. That is not the behavior of a territorial predator defending a boundary. That is the behavior of something that has been watching a specific piece of ground night after night from a fixed position, with a consistency that implies routine. That consistency was the thing I could not account for through any framework I had. A bear working a range does not choose a single observation point and return to it on consecutive nights. The behavior I was documenting implied an individual that had been assessing my camp the way I would assess an unfamiliar structure on a patrol route, returning until it was satisfied it had gathered what it needed, or until something changed. I did not know what it needed. That uncertainty was the most uncomfortable part of all of it. I sat at the fire from 9 o'clock.
I kept the fire modest, not a large blaze, just enough for warmth and light at the immediate ring. I had a cup of coffee and I sat in the camp chair and I did not read. I watched the timber edge. At 11:20 it was there. Not a gradual appearance. It was simply there. In the way that stillness resolves into shape when you have been looking at the same dark space long enough, the way your eye suddenly organizes what it has been looking at, and the outline locks in and you cannot unsee it.
It was at the same eastern position as the previous nights, 35 to 40 yards out, and it was standing in a way that I can only describe as particular. Not the loaded stillness of the earlier nights. Something different in the weight of the posture, a quality of I do not know the clinical word for it. Guarded, not defensive. Guarded in the way an animal moves when it is managing something it would rather not reveal. I stayed still for 20 minutes. It stayed at the timber edge for the entirety of that time. At some point, probably around minute 12, I became aware of something I had not been aware of before. A slight asymmetry in the silhouette. The right shoulder carried higher than the left by several inches. Not a posture thing, the body's weight was not shifted toward the left, which is what you see when a large animal favors a limb. The shoulder itself sat differently. Something in the joint, or above it. Something that was not acute, not the held quality of a fresh wound, but settled, the way old damage settles. I do not know what had happened to it. I do not know if it had been that way since birth or whether something in the years before my camp had shaped it. What I do know is that it changed the quality of the encounter for me in a way I was not prepared for. 22 years of wildlife work builds a particular kind of fluency with injured animals, the way their presence in a field situation introduces variables that trained judgment cannot resolve in advance. An injured animal's behavior is unpredictable not because it is irrational, but because pain modifies the priority hierarchy in ways the observer cannot know. What would have been a non-threat can become a threat. What would have been a threat sometimes becomes something else entirely. What I was looking at was a Sasquatch, and I am saying the word plainly now, because I have been building toward it for this entire account, and there is no point in further circumvention. A Sasquatch that was managing an old injury, standing at the edge of my camp for the 5th consecutive night, watching. At minute 22 it moved. Not along the timber edge as on the previous nights. Directly toward the camp. 6 steps. I counted them. Then it stopped. 25 yards. That is not a comfortable distance for anything the size of what I was looking at. That is inside the distance at which decisions become immediate. My hand went to the camp chair arm not because I had decided to stand, but because the body prepares itself on its own schedule. It made a sound. Not a vocalization in the way you think of vocalization, not a call or a yell or the chest percussion vocalizations that the Sierra Sounds recordings documented, which Ron Moorhead and Al Berry made in the California Sierras in the early 70s and which no acoustic analyst has ever attributed to a known species. This was a single exhalation. Deliberate, not distress. Not threat, a sound that had a directed quality aimed at me in the way a sound can be aimed. I do not know what it communicated. I am not going to assign an interpretation I cannot support. Then it turned, and it walked back to the timber edge, and it was gone. I do not mean it disappeared into the trees. I heard it walk, right, left, into the forest to the south, the sound diminishing over maybe 20 seconds, and then nothing. Gone into 60,000 acres of national forest that I have walked for 2 decades and know well, and that does not give up what lives in it without consent. I sat by that fire until 4 in the morning. I called nobody. I sat with the coffee going cold in the cup and the fire dying down and the insects and the frogs doing what they do in August in those creek bottoms. And I thought about what I had spent 22 years believing about that country. and what I had spent 5 nights having quietly and methodically revised, here is what I have to tell you, because this is the part that matters, the part that is going to sit with you the way it sits with me. 2 nights before the 5th night, the night Warren was with me. The 4th night I had heard, coming from the western property line around 10 in the evening, a sound that I had taken for a coyote, short, sharp, a single bark-like note from the brush about 80 yards west. I had noted it and dismissed it. There is a man named Terry Oakes who has a small hunting camp about a quarter-mile west of my western fence line. He has been there as long as I have been on my property, and I know him the way neighbors in that country know each other, to wave to borrow from in emergencies, to trust not to build something on the fence line without a conversation. His camp is where he takes his teenage grandson, some years. He had mentioned, 2 weeks before all of this started, that the boy was coming out in late July. On the morning after the 4th night, I drove the fence line road on the way out, and I saw Terry's truck. I stopped. He was loading gear. He said they were packing up early. The boy had not slept well for 3 nights. Jumpy, hearing things he could not explain from the south. Terry laughed about it, said city kids were not built for the Ouachitas in August. I laughed too. I said I had heard some unusual things myself. I did not say more than that. I have thought about that conversation more times than I can accurately count. The boy was 80 yards from my western fence line on the nights the Sasquatch was at my timber edge. The Sasquatch would have had his scent, his sounds, his fire. A compromised animal operating on modified parameters is not predictable. I do not know what would have happened if the boy had been curious enough or unlucky enough to walk east through the brush at the wrong moment on one of those nights. Nothing happened. That is the fact. Nothing happened to Terry's grandson, who drove back to wherever he came from without knowing what had been standing at the timber edge of the property next to his camp. But I know, and the knowing is something I have been carrying since that August, which is now 3 years ago, and which has not lightened. I spoke with a researcher the following spring, a man whose name I am not going to use, who works out of a university I am also not going to name, who studies primate locomotion and who took my camera image and spent 3 weeks with it. He told me that the shoulder asymmetry I had described, asymmetry consistent with an old proximal humerus fracture or a healed joint impingement, would produce exactly the gait deviation I had observed, the slight drag quality on the right side, the compensatory lean. He told me that in known great apes, injuries of that type are commonly sustained in falls from trees, from cliff faces. He did not tell me what the image showed. I did not ask him to. He was careful with his language in a way that I recognized as professional self-preservation, which I respected. He did not file anything either. What I can tell you is this. There are 4 camera images of the timber edge from those nights. There is one image of a silhouette that my wildlife biology background cannot explain, and that a primate locomotion researcher spent 3 weeks analyzing. There is the direct observation of a trained field warden and a retired wildlife biologist. And there is an account I have given once to the researcher and am giving now and do not intend to give again. I still have the property. I go out in August, as I always have. I have not modified the camp. I have not taken down the trail cameras, though I repositioned them after that summer. I sit by the fire on the nights I am there, and I watch the timber edge the way I have always watched it and the way I expect to watch it for whatever time is left of this. I have never seen it again, but there are things I do not do now that I did before, reflexively without thinking. I do not leave the fire ring area in the first hour after dark when I am at the property alone. I do not take the south fence line path on moonless nights. I do not assume when I hear a single footfall at the timber edge that resolves into nothing, that it was a deer. Those are not large adjustments in the way a person might measure adjustments. I am not afraid to be there. I am not afraid of what is in that forest. But the specific confidence I had before the assumption that 22 years had taught me the full inventory of what lived in that country, that I had catalogued the apex and the subordinate and the transient and the resident and had a working understanding of all of it, that confidence is gone, and it is not coming back, and I am not sure it should. The image is still on my hard drive, time-stamped, unedited. If you want to tell me what it shows, I would be interested to hear your explanation.